Hello, Endersword here again, this time with another video about damage. This should be a basic concept in Star Trek Fleet Command, but it's really not. There's so many things that go into what your damage output ultimately is that I think a lot of people get lost and really don't see the connection between the actions they take and the damage output that they're doing and success against different hostiles and things like that. And I wanted to kind of present maybe the way that I think about it when I approach whether you should get a certain upgrade or pursue a certain officer or something like that. So the way that I tend to think about this is as a damage cube. So I kind of think of damage as basically three dimensions that you can use to increase the volume of the cube that we're looking at. So I'll explain what I mean by that by starting with the very basic x-axis of this, which is the base damage. So essentially the damage that you're doing if nothing else is happening. So I went back and used a level 8 account to fire with a Rialta to see if we just don't upgrade this thing at all, don't do any research, what is it starting at? It was actually a tier 4 Rialta, so that all of these examples will be on the same page. But really, there's no research done here. There's not really a lot of buildings. Nothing is increasing the base damage that this is doing. And that early Rialta is firing at 62 damage per shot on average. I did it a few times. Then I got someone to help who is level 42. Said just kind of send out a Rialta without any crew. Tell me about the average amount, and it seemed to be 645 standard damage. So in the early 40s, you're expecting your damage bonus, which is the amount that you're getting from research, from your buildings added together, maybe from artifacts, things like that, to be about 3,000 to 4,000% or so in terms of your total damage bonus at this point. Basically, what that's doing is taking your base damage, multiplying it by your damage bonus, and that is giving you your damage output in this case. There's also a few little exceptions to that where there's research that you can do that gives an actual set numerical increase to the weapon damage that you're doing instead of a percentage basis, but there's only a couple of those. Usually throughout the game, it's a percentage, and the percentage is always additive. So if you've got three things that say 100% bonus, that's just 300%. It's not 100, then times 100, then times 100. It doesn't multiply it or double it each time. It's basically just taking all of that, adding it up, and multiplying the base damage that you're doing by that. And this essentially is going to give you your x-axis. So on my own account here, which is then higher, the bonus damage at level 60, you're probably somewhere between 6,000 to 8,000%. The type of ship you're using in terms of like the faction and the battle triangle can make a difference. The type of target that you're actually hitting, if you're hitting like a Klingon ship versus a neutral ship, as I was in this case, it's going to make a difference in terms of the damage bonus that you're doing. But I'm getting this number around 2150. The actual number doesn't really matter, but it's illustrative that basically the stock ship is only doing a tiny bit of this, and the rest of it is coming from your research, your buildings, your things like that. And I'm not even adding a crew into it yet. But basically, this is giving us our x-axis. So it's giving us one dimension of what's going to end up being this damage cube. The next dimension coming into it is criticals. So this is now going to take our x and multiply it by y. So anytime we hit for a critical, it's going to take that base and bonus damage together and multiply the entire thing by the critical damage bonus that we do. In my case, my critical damage is going to be about 880%. Again, it's going to depend on the type of target you're hitting, if it's a player, if it's an armada, if it's a hostile from a certain faction, whatever. And it's going to depend, obviously, on your research, your level, your buildings, things like that. Some of the most crucial things are your Bajoran research for critical damage and your Q building for critical damage, as it makes a really big difference. It can change it by hundreds, depending on what level those various things are. There's also primes out there, whatever. So it really depends on how much you put in. But even at a free to play, again, with the example of the level 42 that helped me out, theirs was about 330%. Mine's at 880, obviously 20 levels higher than that. Find out what yours is. The way that you can figure out approximately what yours is at, you can either actually go through all your research of buildings and just add them up, or you could basically look at do a bunch of fights, look at your damage done when you don't crit and your average damage done when you do crit, and just divide the two. And that's going to give you a really good approximation of what your critical damage actually is without having to go through everything and add it up. And you're just having an innate 150% to begin with, even before anything else. Added on to the critical damage is going to then be hull breach. So now we're starting to get into officer abilities. In this case, I used B'Elanna Torres below deck. And once you add hull breach to a target and you crit on that target, it's going to take the total amount and just straight up multiply it by 1.5. So now we're critting for 31,538. So 10,500 of that came from the hull breach, 18,800 came from the crit, and then some of that was from the original damage itself. You're starting to see that the original base stock damage of a ship is getting absolutely overwhelmed by the other types of damage we can do, and our kind of equation here is getting a little bit longer as we go. Then, of course, there is another whole type of damage, which essentially creates a bit of a mirror rectangle or mirror cube. This is going to be the isolytic damage, which is still relatively new, but for anyone that still doesn't totally know how this works, it literally calculates the standard damage that you're going to do and simply mirrors that based on the percentage of isolytic damage you have. The game presents this in two ways. They tell you that some things have an isolytic damage percentage and some things have an isolytic cascade percentage. I don't know why they added the word cascade. It doesn't mean anything. It means the same thing as the isolytic damage percentage. It's just all additive together. So if you've got an officer that does 10, one that does 15, and then an artifact that does 20, then you're going to be adding that all together just linearly, and that's going to be your damage output. In this case, I'm at 198%. This was a fully loaded on isolytic crew, and I've got some of the artifacts as well that boost that conditionally. Some of the artifacts depend on what type of ship you're fighting, what type of ship you're in, and what you're fighting. Some of them depend that a certain state is present. So in this case, hull breach had to be present in order to activate some artifacts and so on. But basically, this is just adding on a mirror damage to the total damage you're doing, and now taking me up to a total of very close to 94,000 damage that we're doing in total to the target. The other dimension to this is going to be the Z-axis, which is extra shots. This isn't going to apply as much in hostile fights, as I don't think there are really officers that do extra shots against just hostiles. Some ships have the ability that do that. I think the Tribune is one that actually adds extra shots, but those are fairly rare. But there are definitely officers that add extra shots against armadas, and in particular in PvP. So one example of those is going to be Miles O'Brien. He is going to, for 3 rounds, add a 50% chance of firing extra shots by 100%. So he's basically just going to straight up double the amount of shots that you fire out of any given weapon. And Chakotay does a similar thing. So both of these guys are super valuable when it comes to fighting against armadas. Here he's going to do 40% extra shots versus armadas. If you get him with 2 synergy officers, that's going to raise that to 100%. So once again, he is going to double the output. So you're going to take your damage, multiply it by your crits, and then multiply that by 2 once you're using these officers to increase the extra shots. In PvP, we've got a similar situation that all the original strike team folks and Carol Freeman have an ability of some kind that does extra shots. In this case, Gul Dukat, when shot while on an interceptor fighting a player ship with hull breach, it is going to increase the number of shots by 42% once per weapon for 5 rounds. So if you end up in a long fight with Gul Dukat, he's going to be eventually hitting 200-300% extra damage or extra shots out of those weapons and firing a lot. Carol Freeman does a flat 100% right from the beginning. Somebody like Wei Un, depending on its tier, I think at tier 4, does 100% for 2 rounds. So 100 and then 200 in the following round. So things like that make a really, really big difference, obviously in PvP and in Armadas in particular. Again, anything that's giving you those extra shots is just flat taking all the damage you're doing and straight up doubling it. It's just adding a completely extra round of shots to what you're doing. If you usually fire 3 times, you're going to fire 6 times. It's just that simple, and they're going to have the same chance to crit, same chance to do isolytic, whatever. So it's just multiplicatively going to end up being better for you in those situations. Now, if we look at the difference between normal damage and isolytic damage, Isolytic, as I said, is a mirror of normal damage. If you had an isolytic damage of 100%, then if you did 1,000,000 points of normal damage, you're going to do 1,000,000 points of isolytic damage. However, they aren't worth the same thing in terms of actual functionality. The isolytic damage is worth more. And the reason for that, particularly against hostiles that do not have any isolytic defense, is that isolytic damage is essentially worth 1 over 1 minus the mitigation of the target when you come to comparing the shield damage and the hull damage that you do to it. I'll show you an example of that. So here, in this case, I'm doing 19 million some odd in standard damage, 42 million in isolytic damage. But if I want to compare point by point, if I had the opportunity to add 1,000 extra isolytic damage or 1,000 extra standard damage, which would I take? What I want to look at is the mitigation. In this case, it's going to mitigate 11,910,000 damage. I'm going to divide that by the amount of standard damage that I did and get to the rate that it has mitigated 0.6168 of that damage. So basically every shot, every point of isolytic damage I'm doing is actually worth essentially the inverse of the negative of that. So only 29 point something percent is actually getting through. Or sorry, 39 point something percent is getting through, but the isolytic damage 100% would get through, and then they're both mitigated by the shields and hit the hull at the same rate after that. So basically for each point of normal damage, a point of isolytic damage is worth 2.6 times as much. So the fact that I'm already doing more isolytic damage than standard, this isolytic damage of 42 million is worth well over 100 million of normal damage that I'm actually doing to this ship. And again, the level that I'm at doesn't really matter here. You can go out and test this against the type of targets you want to be hitting, find out what this differential is in terms of mitigation, and then see basically the higher it's mitigating you. So essentially the more you're punching up against harder and harder targets, the more valuable the isolytic damage actually is. And if you're fighting weaker targets that aren't mitigating you much at all, then the isolytic damage starts to become closer and closer to parity. But the worst it can be is equal, and almost always it's much better than that. And I'd say a typical thing you're probably getting, most things you're going to be grinding are going to be mitigating somewhere between 30 and obviously the maximum of 71%, but you're probably not grinding that too often. It's probably going to be like 30, 50, something like that. And your isolytic is worth about twice as much as what your normal actually is here. So this is the way that I kind of conceptualize the whole thing, as basically coming up with a cube to say what your total damage is, and then like a mirror cube to say what your isolytic damage is, which is then kind of multiplied by the actual effectiveness of that isolytic damage. And I find that a lot of the crews that are now kind of in vogue in the game, that are part of the meta, kind of cut both ways in that they're good at isolytic. They can help you out in defense in some cases, and they can help you out in extra loot. So if you are going for pure offense, you can use something like the E Picard E Data, and then throw on either Janeway or 5 if you're looking to really maximize loot. Those are going to be doing isolytic damage for you, as well as increasing the loot output. And very often in this game now, being able to end a target's life quicker can actually be better for your defense, particularly against certain stronger hostiles, such as the silent enemies, where they actually ramp up the critical damage that they're doing against you, as well as burning you for each round. The quicker that you can get through the fight and get through their hull is actually going to outweigh mitigation or playing defensively, because they get stronger the longer they live. So you just want to end them as quick as possible. And then there's some hybrid ones that you can do too. Something that's very popular now is doing something like Janeway and either adding in the Doctor or Torres, or somebody for synergy, and then sticking the other wing as E-Data to add more isolytic. So Janeway herself is doing isolytic and giving you extra shield mitigation, and Data is also giving you more isolytic on top of that. And obviously we've got Nurse Chapel now as a new isolytic officer, which is really, really helpful below deck. So when you're kind of comparing who am I going to put as my, limited below deck slots, you're still probably always going to have Hugh, as he is going to increase that dimension of the critical damage. He doesn't do damage increase, but he does chance increase. And obviously the more often you hit the crits, the more often you get the damage. So if you kind of look at the full damage equation here, you have to consider the chance of hitting the crit and then the damage bonus to it. Also the chance of hitting hull breach and the damage bonus to it. Whereas isolytic is guaranteed. Extra shots can also be with Miles, it's not guaranteed. With Chakotay it is. With some of the strike team officers, it depends. Some of them, again, they require a condition to happen. So if there's a chance that condition doesn't happen, then they're not guaranteed, and you may want to put it in. But usually if you're using full synergy, there is a 100% chance of getting that. So yeah, basically consider that all together. And if you're trying to decide, hey, this thing is killing me, or I'm not efficiently fighting against these hostiles, or I think I can be doing more damage to this armada, then you want to be looking at essentially the dimensions of this. I'm calling it a cube. I guess it's really a rectangular prism or something, because they're not all equal. But you're looking to maximize the volume of this thing. And the weapon damage is usually something that goes up over time as you tier your ship up, as you research stuff. You can't really just trigger that way up or way down in most cases, but you can often control the critical damage, the extra shots, the isolytic, that provide you a whole lot more, and then make your decisions based on that. So if you're fighting something that you're finding, hey, I'm mitigating reasonably well, but this is just really chewing into my hull, or this is depleting my shield before I kill it, so then it's doing a lot of hull damage to me before I get it dead. You can look at, are there any of these elements that I can increase? I can remove some of my defense and put in extra isolytic, or go the other way. Maybe I'm overkilling it and I can be more defensive and get more kills out of it. So this is the way I tend to look at it. I hope that will help somebody. I didn't want to get into the weeds of like every single research and artifact and whatever, but when you're considering what to upgrade, what things to go for, what officers to go for, things like that, definitely consider these, because isolytic super important, crit super important, and that hull breach in particular. Out of those three things, the morale, burning, and hull breach is just such a universal damage increaser. It just increases everything at the end of the day by an extra 50%, and that works out really well in your favor. So hope this helps, and let me know if you have any questions or anything I was unclear on. And I think I'm going to do more of these, like getting to the basics of the game that should be basic but are often very unclear when you're in the game itself. So let me know if this is helpful. Thanks.